market crashed. This affected my mom and dad because it led to the Depression. So how many people know people who grew up during the Depression? How many people know them because they wanted job security and pensions? Really, really a lot. And that's really affected their thinking. So then 1929, after that, led to 1933, and it led to the New Deal, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he came out with the New Deal in Social Security. Interestingly enough, in 1933, Hitler came to power also. Now, this is why it's so important. As I said right now, savers are losing their savings. The reason this is so important is because Hitler came to power because the middle class had their savings wiped out. And the same thing is happening right now, is that if 401ks and pensions don't work and savings don't work, it may bring rise to another type of political party. So in 1933, two guys were elected, FDR, Hitler. And the other thing that's interesting is on the cash flow game, as I said, in 1933, this is what they formed here, was called I call the fast track. And in 1933, a man named Joseph Kennedy, father of John Kennedy, created this here, investments only for the rich here, because they wanted to separate the poor and middle class from getting into the better investments or the riskier investments. So this is what they formed here. So that's why 1933 is a very important year. The next year is 1943, as we said, Current Tax Payment Act. Because we were in World War II at the time, and the federal government needed so much money, they said, let's pick on the employees. And that's why today, employees, every time you pick up your paycheck, it's goes, ah! How many people have ever done that? What happened to my money? You know? So the 43 Tax Act was the one that nailed the employees right here. It's Current Tax Payment Act. Then we go to 1964, and LBJ created what's called the Great Society. But it also gave rise to Medicare, which is the biggest problem we have today. And I'll show you the numbers on Medicare. And it's socialism at its best, because going back to 1929, the World War II generation really wanted government to protect people. And I think it's a great idea if we can afford it. But today we cannot afford that, and that's the problem. So the problems today that not so much my generation, the baby boom generation is not going to face it, is those of you born after 1964 are the ones that are going to be paying for the actions taken in 1929, 1933, 43, and 64. So your youngsters are going to pay for my golf fees, and I really appreciate that a lot. So anyway, then we go to 1971, and as I said, that was the year that Nixon took us off the gold standard. The gold standard at that time was known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was formed in 1944. That change has caused every saver to be a loser right now. It's because the federal government can print money. It's not really money, it's now a currency. We don't save money, we save currency anymore. And that's why the savers are going to lose. You notice the same thing happened that brought Hitler to power. The very same thing that happened in 71 is what caused the Weimar government to print money so fast. So history may not repeat, but it sounds alike. It's very similar. So we're heading for the same direction. Next date is this. 74 was ERISA, which led to the 401k in the 1980s. The reason that's so important is because it was the first time big businesses were no longer going to take care of our employees. It was a shift from the defined benefit pension plans that the General Motors and United Airlines have, which are today bankrupt anyway, to the defined contribution pension plans. The reason that's so important is it was a shift away from socialism and into capitalism. That's why 1974, at least to me, is such an important year. It was also the year I came back from Vietnam. Next year is this, 1980 was Reagan and Thatcher, and governments came into view. They were more capitalistic. So the battle between socialism and capitalism was raging on. If you remember that Reagan was the guy that crushed, the air traffic controller strike and kicked the unions out and all this. So basically the workers over here by this time were really having a hard time because the government was now capitalist and not socialist. So the benefits they once enjoyed were now being taken away. Next is this, 86 Tax Reform Act. As Sharon said, it was the doctors, lawyers, and accountants. These guys then got nailed. They got the worst tax breaks possible. So a guy like me doesn't have the same tax things that these guys have. So again, the shift away from socialism to capitalism is taking place, and they're picking on this side of the quadrant. Next date. 1989 was the Berlin Wall came down. The reason that's so significant was 89 was the Berlin Wall came down. It shifted away, said that communist Europe, which is Russia, Hungary, and those countries, were now shifting to capitalism. So even the socialists were communists were becoming capitalists. Another thing about 1989 was that's the year the World Wide Web came up and technology took over. So the changes were so fast, but our school systems still say to the kids, go to school and get a safe, secure job with pensions and benefits and all that. The reason school teachers can say that is because they're government employees. And that's fine. The trouble is our governments are technically bankrupt right now. They cannot afford it. Next date is this, was the 1996 Telecom Reform Act. The reason 1996 is so important is Telecom Reform Act gave rise to a company like Global Crossing, and they were able to spread fiber optic cable all over the world. What that meant was it is now cheaper for me to hire an accountant in either India or the Philippines. I can hire a doctor, a computer programmer in the Philippines or Ireland or Russia. The Telecom Reform Act made it cheaper for me to call overseas than it did to call next door. So that's why that was so important. And then in 2001, China joins the WTO. And the reason that's so important was the biggest communist country in the world became capitalist. And meanwhile, our school systems are still telling you to go to school, get a safe, secure job, look for a pay raise, get pension benefits and all that. That is such an obsolete idea because it is a shift now from socialism to capitalism, and now we're competing against some of the biggest, most powerful countries in the world. If you think you can get a pay raise and work harder to get yourself out of this situation, some can, but most people will not. Very simply because after this whole shift came about, governments can no longer protect you. Socialism, as we know it, is kaput. And I think it's about time our school systems start coming up to speed and stop protecting people, with the idea of pensions and those benefits, because those ideas are gone. And that's why I cover in the whole thing the shift from socialism to capitalism and watching the historical changes. So what that means is your children will probably not be able to get those high-paying jobs and all this, or is able to sit there and collect more benefits or go on strike, which all those union guys do and all this. You better start producing, or as Bob Dylan says, you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. So that's why those dates are so important. It is a shift from socialism to capitalism. My mom and dad, bless their hearts, were very kind people. I would say they're socialists. That's why they believe the government and companies should take care of people. That is an obsolete idea. Today, in ultra competitive capitalism, you'd better produce or you're out. Because if you want a higher paying job, I'll just hire somebody away from you in India or something like that. Does that make sense, you guys here? And that's why I would say the school system is so obsolete, and they better start teaching people financial education as soon as possible. Thank you. So welcome back, and we're going into what I think is a more interesting subject. It's a subject called the game of money. And the way I got this from is from my rich dad. He said that life is much like a football game or a basketball game. It's in 4 quarters. So I know some of you may not like sports, but just bear with me here. So what the game of money looks like is to go up here. First of all, there's a pregame show. So when you watch a football game, the rah-rah and the cheerleaders and all that stuff, and you have the commentators talking about, well, I think the Orioles are going to win or this is going to win and all this stuff. Then you get into the first quarter, and that's ages 25 to 35. Now, the reason I call it 4 quarters is because generally our working lifetime is 25 to 65, which is 40 years, right, 40 years. So the first 10 years is 25 to 35, and that's the first quarter of your life, all right? And generally, the first quarter of your life, you're just trying to figure out who you are. How many people really did not know who you are in the first quarter of your life, right? How many people still don't know today who you are? I really didn't know. Then 35 to 45 is the second quarter of your life, okay? And then you go into the halftime show, okay? Some people call that a midlife crisis. And what that means is a person goes, oh my goodness, I'm not getting promoted, I'm not climbing the corporate ladder, maybe I should go do something else, maybe I should go back to school and all this. How many people understand what I mean about the midlife crisis? And you really question whether you're successful or not, did they make the right decisions? A lot of people change careers at this time. So you go into the third quarter, and that's 45 to 55, and then you go to the fourth quarter, which is 55 to 65. And hopefully by age 65, in the old days, in the World War II generation, that's when you generally retired and you went to play golf for the rest of your life. The problem is, a lot of times today with the 401ks and pensions going broke with the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation and all this, that many people will not be able to retire at age 65, so they go into OT, overtime. And what overtime sounds like is, would you like me to supersize that, please? You want Cokes, you want French fries with it and all this, and that's what overtime looks like. And it's really quite interesting. I'm not sure in this rule, but if you're collecting Social Security and you have a second job, they don't let you make too much money because you have to stay on Social Security. I'm not sure on the rules of that thing. But you either have to take Social Security or work at the fast food place. And then after a while, it's called out of time. And out of time is when your body can no longer stand up and go to work. Another way of saying it, my rich dad used to say it to me, he says, most people spend their health gaining wealth. And in the last 2 years of their life, they spend their wealth trying to gain back their health. And they've shown that most people let go of their entire fortune within the last 18 months of their life because they're struggling, they're paying medical bills and all that. Does that make sense, you guys here? That's really what it is. So the pregame show is some people win the game of life in the pregame show, like Paris Hilton, that beautiful, intelligent young woman. She's very talented. She was born, I think, with $300 million in cash. So just by being born, the pregame show, she was out of the rat race and she was fine. And then for Kim, my wife, she won the game in the first quarter of her life. She was 37 years old. She exited. She had more than enough passive income, which is what this game teaches people here, is how to get out of the rat race and onto the fast track of life, and you're free to do what you want. So Kim won the game out of the rat race in the first quarter. And it took me till the second quarter. I was about 47 as I started to exit the rat race, and I was financially free. So when people ask me, what does money buy you? Well, some people, money buys problems. And for me, money bought me freedom. It bought Kim freedom. So if you work till 65, it bought Kim approximately 30 years of freedom, and it bought me approximately 20 years of freedom. So that's why I think it's important that financial education is important, except our school system still wants you to work till you're 65 and then go into overtime. That doesn't make any sense to me. So then that's some of the differences. And unfortunately, many people, the baby boom generation, I'm now in the fourth quarter, but all I'm doing is playing the same game I played most of my life. And I just get richer and richer and richer. And unfortunately, the baby boomers are now hitting into the fourth quarter. And the problem with the baby boom generation, and why I'm saying there's going to be a huge change, goes back to this diagram right here, what I started with, is that up to the year 2000, the population looked like this. You had a few rich, a few poor, and a lot of middle class. But now that the baby boom generation is starting to migrate and change, by the year 2020, that's why I say I think the diagram is going to look more like lots of poor people here. And what's going to cause that shift are 75 million baby boomers retiring. So if you look at the stats here, it's just simple math. If you look on this chart here, look at there's approximately 75 million baby boomers, and let's say each one is now going to collect $1,000 a month from Social Security and Medicare. That comes out to $75 billion a month. That's a lot of money. The Iraq War is costing us $4 billion right now. So what we have as an IOU is $75 billion. Now, most people, well, what does a billion mean? It means basically we can't pay for it, or those born after 1964 are going to pay for it. But when you look at another stat up on that chart there, how much is a billion and a trillion? If you start counting at $1 per second, okay, how long does it take you to count $1 million? Will take you 12 days at $1 a second. So that's 12 days, you could be a millionaire. It's not that bad. But a billion takes 32 years. That's the jump. And this is the best part. A trillion takes 32,000 years. And so what's happened is the federal government is running up this bill at such a high rate of speed just because of 1971, like I said, they're allowed to print funny money. That's why I said the biggest change is funny money, and the world will be willing to accept it. So when you look at this, what is the price of Social Security and Medicare? And as my Japanese friends say, Social Security. I said, that's what it is. It is so, Because as the change goes into effect, this is the IOU starting back in 1935. 1935, Social Security came in. We owe $10 trillion. Now, it takes 32,000 years to count a trillion. In 1964, Medicare, around there, 64 came in. Medicare is $64 trillion. And President Bush just passed the Prescription Drug Act and all that to get reelected. So the total price is $74 trillion. That is more money than all the stock markets and all the bond markets throughout the world. That is how big a promise they've made as campaign pledges. So if you study empires, which I study, the reason that the United States is going to go down, why the Roman Empire went down, is very simply because our politicians were able to make promises they never had to keep. Like when FDR made the promise of Social Security, there's a recorded transcript of him actually saying, he says, I'm only doing this to get reelected. He was reelected 4 times. And the reason LBJ brought in Medicare was to get, hopefully, because the war in Vietnam was so unpopular, he was hoping to get popular. So what brings down every great republic is very simply because politicians are allowed to make promises they're not going to keep ever. And we're right at this juncture right now, which is why I say we're about to have one of the biggest migrations possible. And the reason I created this product here, Teach to Be Rich, is, as I said, you know, the rich are going to get richer. And this is the middle class. And the middle class will pay for these people here. I don't expect Teach to Be Rich to solve the problem, but it may help some of your friends and families go this way rather than go this way. Because if you're going to try and work hard, that 96 Telecom Reform Act is going to stop that, because even today, if I'm a doctor and attorney, I can hire a doctor attorney in India. And I can hire a computer programmer for $12 an hour versus $200 an hour. Everything's changed. You know, if you're trying to save money, the federal government's going to print it faster than you can save it. You're not saving money, you're saving a currency anyway. So that's why I created this product here, the cash flow games, and may you teach your friends and family. There's no guarantees, but maybe some of them will not be part of the casualty that'll go this way. Now, I'm not saying I'm absolutely certain this happened, but that's what it looks like is going to happen. Does that make sense, you guys here? And that's my concern, and that's why I create this product over here, because that's how severe the situation is. Worst of all, the reason we get into a $74 trillion debt, again, goes back to my very first flip chart, is that people have no financial education. If you have no financial education, you cannot read a financial statement. And what happens then is this. This is the U.S. government. We have $74 trillion. It's called an off-balance sheet accounting. They do not have to record this. That's why they say, well, it's only about a $30 billion debt and all this. They do not have to report this. And as long as we're financially illiterate, we will not see this. The same companies that did this was Enron. Remember them? They had off-balance sheet accounting. That's against the law. The other company that did that was a little company called Arthur Andersen, an accounting firm. They had off-balance sheet accounting. The other person that does that is a U.S. government. They do that. The difference is they can do it legally. So by having a financially illiterate nation, it only going to set up the greater possibility that will allow this to happen here. The reason I don't like stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, especially mutual funds, is they don't ever give you a financial statement. The reason mutual funds are for people who are financially illiterate, that they don't have to report the expenses inside of here. The same thing as the federal government will tell you that there's no inflation and there's no debt. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So I'll say it once again, the reason we got into this problem is the same reason the federal government, the Roman government went down, the Roman Empire. Same reason ours is in trouble today is because we have a financially illiterate populace, and the politicians can make promises that they never have to keep. And this is not just a problem of the poor. From presidents on down, there's so many people that are part of this problem. Teach to Be Rich wants to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Does that make sense, you guys here? So when we come back, we'll go into one last solution. But this is why I created this product, Teach to Be Rich, is because maybe you can help yourself and your friends get out of this mess. Thank you very much.
Investor, educator, and author Robert Kiyosaki has changed millions of lives all over the world. His book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for over 5 years. We all know that the gap between the haves and the have-nots is growing, and Social Security and Medicare are in a financial mess. And just affording to live is getting expensive. So how does a person get ahead financially? The answer is raising your financial IQ and having your money work for you. Here's Robert Kiyosaki with Rich Dad's Teach to Be Rich.
So the reason I created Teach to Be Rich and this cash flow game, the real purpose was to teach people how to understand the fundamentals of accounting. Like when people say, what was Rich Dad, Poor Dad about? It's fundamentally a book on accounting, because you have to be able to read these things. Otherwise, you're completely suckered in all the time by such things as off-balance sheet accounting like this. This is illegal. If you and I did this, we would go to jail here. So this is what the world's greatest investor, Warren Buffett, says about the importance of understanding accounting or financial statements is this. He says, when managers want to get across the facts of the business to you, it can be done within the rules of accounting. Unfortunately, when they want to play games, at least in some industries, it can also be done within the rules of accounting. So they're playing games right here, and people cannot see the difference. If you can't recognize the differences, you shouldn't be in equity or stocks or real estate or anything for that matter if you can't read financial statements in equity picking business. In other words, if you're going to be an active investor, you have to understand this here. And that's why we created the cash flow game and all of these products. But there's another reason I use games, and I thought I'd best bring up my A student partner, Sharon, to explain why games are such important teaching tools. So Sharon, would you please come up here? May I have a hand for her, please?
Thank you, Robert. I have just a short story to tell you. The book, Teach to Be Rich, Robert had handed me the first edited version, or the first version, for me to start working on. And literally the next day, I had a meeting at ASU, and they were looking at the game, doing a research project for us on the cash flow game.
You better say who ASU is, because this is going national.
Yes. ASU is Arizona State University, and they're right here in Tempe, Arizona. But they are literally doing a research project on our behalf on the importance of games and the effectiveness specifically of the cash flow game. So we're very excited, because even though we're not trying to work through the educational system, it's starting to turn around and come to us, and I'm very happy about that. But the very next day after Teach to Be Rich was done, and it was in my hands, I'm listening to these educators inside the system, and they hand me this document called The Cone of Learning. Now, you can't read everything, but I just want to point out the source. Dale, 1969. Now, this information was developed and released to the educational marketplace in 1969. What's important about this is how you learn, the effectiveness of learning. At the bottom is reading.
I'll just draw it in bigger diagrams here. What the Cone of Learning said was that the worst way to learn is via reading. And what our school system says are smart people are people who can read. And I'm not a very good reader, and that's why I had a very, 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 very tough time in school. The second way, they say, is the worst way of learning. And these are teachers. This guy Dale in 1969, they've known this for years. The second way, the worst way of learning, is via lecture. How many people in school were ever really bored during a lecture? How many people sometimes felt it was a waste of time? Good. But yet that's what our teachers are designed to do. They want you to read and they lecture. And that's why so many young people drop out of school today, because they can't stand it anymore. So go on so we can move up and then.
I was at